The train's whistle cut through the October morning like a blade, its mournful cry echoing off the towering peaks of the Colorado Rockies. Clara Bennett pressed her gloved hand against the cold window, watching as the small mountain town of Cedar Ridge came into view through swirling snow. Her breath fogged the glass as she studied the collection of weathered buildings huddled against the mountainside, their rooftops dusted white like sugar on gingerbread. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She clutched the worn letter in her other hand, the paper soft. From countless readings over the past 3 months, the careful script of Robert Ashford had promised her a new life, a modest home overlooking the valley, and a partnership built on mutual respect rather than the desperation that had driven so many women west. At 24, Clara had buried both parents to consumption in the tenements of Boston, sold everything she owned, and spent her last $15 on a train ticket to this remote corner of Colorado territory. The locomotive shuddered to a halt with a tremendous hiss of steam and grinding of metal. Clara gathered her worn carpet bag and the small trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. Her dark brown hair was pinned severely beneath a black wool hat, and her traveling dress, though clean and mended, showed the signs of a woman who had learned to make do with little. As she stepped onto the wooden platform, the mountain air hit her like a physical blow. The altitude made her slightly dizzy, and the cold bit through her thin coat with startling intensity. She had never experienced anything like the crisp, thin air of the high country, so different from the humid, coal smoke atmosphere of Boston's crowded streets. Cedar Ridge appeared even smaller from the platform than it had from the train window. A single main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, stretched perhaps 3 blocks before giving way to scattered cabins and mining claims that climbed up the mountainsides like scattered dominoes. The town bore the rough, temporary look of a place built quickly around the promise of silver, where men came to get rich fast and leave faster. "Ma'am, you the lady getting off here?" The conductor, a weathered man with kind eyes, had followed her onto the platform with her trunk. "Yes." "Oh, thank you." Clara's voice sounded thin in the mountain air. "I'm looking for Robert Ashford. He was supposed to meet me." The conductor set down her trunk and adjusted his cap. "Don't know that name, ma'am, but you might try the hotel yonder." He pointed to a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign that read Mountain View Inn. "Mrs. Patterson runs it. She knows most folks hereabouts." As the train pulled away with another mournful whistle, Clara found herself alone on the platform with her meager possessions. The few other passengers had already disappeared into the town or been met by rough-looking men who were clearly miners or ranchers. She picked up her carpet bag and began walking toward the hotel, her trunk too heavy to manage alone. The Mountain View Inn proved to be a modest establishment with a small lobby containing a few chairs, a pot-bellied stove, and a registration desk attended by a woman in her 50s with iron-grey hair and sharp blue eyes. She looked up as Clara entered, her expression shifting from indifference to curiosity. "Help you, miss?" "I'm looking for Robert Ashford. I was to meet him here today." Clara set down her bag and produced the letter. "I'm Clara Bennett, from Boston." The woman's expression changed again, this time to something that might have been sympathy. "Robert Ashford, you said?" "Yes. He owns a ranch north of town. We've been corresponding for several months." Clara's voice carried a note of growing uncertainty. "He was quite specific about meeting the October train." Mrs. Patterson came around the desk, her movements deliberate. "Miss Bennett, I'm Martha Patterson. I've been running this hotel for 12 years, and I know every ranch and claim within 50 miles of Cedar Ridge." She paused, her eyes gentle, but direct. "There's no Robert Ashford in these parts. Never has been. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face and gripped the edge of the registration desk for support. "That's impossible. I have his letters. Detailed descriptions of his property, the layout of his house, even the view from his front porch." Martha Patterson studied Clara's pale face with obvious concern. "I'm sorry, dear. It happens more than people like to admit. Confidence men write to Eastern ladies, spinning tales about prosperous ranches and comfortable lives. Usually, they're after money for travel expenses or wedding preparations." Clara sank into one of the lobby chairs, her mind reeling. Robert's letters had been so detailed, so convincing. He had described the challenges of ranching at high altitude, the way the aspen trees turned gold in September, the clarity of the mountain streams. He had never directly asked for money, though she had sent $25 3 weeks ago to help with preparations for their wedding. "Miss Bennet." Martha's voice was gentle. "When did you last hear from Robert Ashford?" 2 weeks ago. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "He wrote about preparing the cabin for winter, about looking forward to showing me the valley where he runs his cattle." Martha nodded sadly. "The details make it convincing. These men do their research, find out enough about an area to sound legitimate. I'm truly sorry." Clara opened her reticule with trembling fingers and counted her remaining money. $3.47. Enough for perhaps 2 nights at the hotel, but certainly not enough for train fare back to Boston. Even if she could afford the return trip, she had nothing to return to. Her parents' tenement had been rented to another family within days of her departure. "I need a room," she said finally, her voice steady despite the shock. "Just for tonight, while I consider my options." "Of course, dear. Room 4 at the top of the stairs. $2 includes supper." Martha's tone was kind but businesslike. "The dining room serves until 8 o'clock. Clara's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the town's main street toward the mountains beyond. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time since leaving Boston, to fully comprehend her situation. She was stranded in a remote mountain town with less than $4 to her name. She had no family, no friends, and no prospects. The man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry existed only in her imagination and a collection of carefully crafted lies. At 24, she was considered a spinster by most standards, too old to expect romantic proposals, too proud to accept charity. But as Clara sat in that small hotel room, something unexpected began to stir within her. It wasn't despair, though. She certainly felt the weight of her circumstances. It wasn't panic, though her situation was clearly desperate. Instead, it was a kind of grim determination that surprised her with its strength. She had survived her parents' deaths and the crushing poverty that followed. She had worked 14-hour days in a textile mill to pay for their medicines and later their burials. She had endured the condescending sympathy of Boston's charitable ladies and the unwanted advances of her supervisor at the mill. If she could survive all of that, she could survive this. Clara unpacked her few belongings and changed from her traveling dress into a simple grey wool dress that had been her best before she bought the traveling outfit. She pinned her hair more neatly and went downstairs to the dining room, where Martha Patterson was serving a simple meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and coffee to a handful of local residents. "Feeling better, dear?" Martha asked as Clara took a seat at a small table near the window. "Yes, thank you. Mrs. Patterson, I wonder if you might know of anyone in town who needs domestic help. I'm experienced in cooking, cleaning, and mending. I can also read and write, and I'm not afraid of hard work." An older man at a nearby table looked up from his stew. He was perhaps 60, with a full grey beard and the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. "You, the lady, came in on the train, the one looking for that fellow who don't exist." "Yes, I'm Clara Bennett, Sam Wheeler. He touched the brim of his hat. Run the general store down the street. My wife passed last spring, and I've been making do with a hired girl who comes in twice a week. Might be able to use someone more. Regular-like. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. What would the position involve? Keeping the store clean, helping with inventory, maybe some cooking. Can't pay much. Room and board plus $3 a week. There's a small apartment above the store. Clara did quick mental calculations. It wasn't generous, but it would keep her fed and housed while she figured out her longer-term prospects. I'd be interested in discussing it further. Come by tomorrow. Morning. We'll see how you take to the work. After Sam Wheeler left, Martha Patterson sat down across from Clara with a cup of coffee. Hi. Sam's a good man, honest and fair. His wife Emily was well regarded in town. The position would be respectable. I appreciate that. Mrs. Patterson, may I ask you something? Is there much opportunity for a woman alone in a place like Cedar Ridge? Martha considered the question seriously. It's a hard country, especially for someone not used to mountain life. Winters are brutal, supplies are expensive, and society is mostly men who came here to mine or ranch. But there are some good people, and a woman who's willing to work and doesn't put on airs can make a place for herself. What about further into the mountains? Are there other settlements? A few mining camps, most of them rough places not suitable for decent women. There are some ranches in the high valleys, but they're isolated, and the people tend to keep to themselves. Martha paused. Why do you ask? Clara wasn't entirely sure why she had asked. Perhaps it was the sense that Cedar Ridge, for all its rough frontier character, still felt constrained by the same social expectations she had hoped to escape in Boston. I suppose I'm curious about what possibilities exist beyond the obvious ones. There's an old man who lives up in Marble Canyon, maybe 20 miles north of here. Goes by the name of James Morrison. Some folks call him the Hermit of Marble Canyon, though he comes to town for supplies every few months. Been up there for years, longer than anyone can remember. What does he do up there? Nobody knows for certain. He's got some kind of operation, mining maybe, or trapping. Keeps to himself, doesn't cause trouble. When he comes to town, he pays in silver and gold, so whatever he's doing, it supports him well enough. Clara found herself intrigued by the idea of someone who had chosen complete solitude in the mountains. Has anyone ever visited his place? Not that I know of. Trail up to Marble Canyon is treacherous, especially this time of year with winter coming on. Most folks figure if Morrison wants company, he'll come to town. If not, that's his business. That night, Clara lay in the narrow hotel bed, listening to the wind howl around the building and thinking about her circumstances. The offer from Sam Wheeler would provide basic security, but it would also lock her into a life very similar to what she had left behind in Boston, working for someone else, dependent on their goodwill, with little hope of true independence. The story Martha had told about the hermit in Marble Canyon stayed with her. Here was someone who had carved out a completely independent existence in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. If a man could do it, why not a woman? The idea was absurd, of course. She knew nothing about mountain survival, had no equipment for such an undertaking, and possessed neither the skills nor the resources for such an extreme existence. But the seed of the idea took root nonetheless, growing stronger as she considered her limited alternatives. The next morning it dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow dusting the peaks that surrounded Cedar Ridge. Clara dressed carefully and made her way to Wheeler's General Store, a sturdy building that occupied a prime location on the town's main street. The interior was crammed with everything from canned goods and dry goods to mining equipment and household necessities. Sam Wheeler proved to be a man of few words but evident fairness. He showed her through the store, explained the inventory system, and outlined the daily routines that would be her responsibility. The apartment above the store was small but adequate, with a sitting room, bedroom, and tiny kitchen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Work's not difficult, but it's steady, Sam explained. Store opens at 7, closes at 6. Sundays we're closed except for emergencies. You'd have your evenings and Sunday afternoons free. What about the winter? Does business slow down? Some. But the mining camps still need supplies, and folks in town stock up regular. We stay busy enough. Sam studied her with shrewd eyes. You seem like you got more education than most who end up in places like this. What brought you west, really? Clara had prepared for this question. I was engaged to a man who proved to be less than honest about his circumstances. Rather than return to Boston, I decided to try making a new start. Sam nodded, accepting the explanation. Fair enough. Everybody's got reasons for being where they are. Can you start tomorrow? Yes. Mr. Wheeler, I appreciate the opportunity. As Clara walked back to the hotel to collect her belongings, she noticed a man loading supplies into a heavy wagon near the general store. He was perhaps 40, tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes were well made but practical. Wool pants, leather boots, and a heavy coat that looked hand-sewn. What caught her attention most was the quantity and quality of his purchases. Bags of flour and beans, cases of canned goods, rolls of canvas, and various tools and hardware. That's Morrison, Martha Patterson said, appearing beside Clara. The Hermit I told you about. Don't see him very often this late in the season. Usually makes his last trip before the heavy snows set in. Clara watched as the man finished loading his wagon with methodical efficiency. He moved with the confident grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, unhurried but purposeful. When he climbed onto the wagon seat, she noticed that his hands were scarred but steady, and his eyes, when they briefly met hers across the street, were a startling shade of grey-green. The wagon rolled out of town heading north, and Clara found herself wondering about the life this mysterious man had built for himself in the remote canyon. What kind of person chose such complete isolation? What did he do with his days? How did he survive the harsh mountain winters? That afternoon, as she helped Sam Wheeler inventory a shipment of goods from Denver, Clara found herself asking questions about life in the high country. Mountain living's not for everyone, Sam explained as they counted tins of beans. Takes a special kind of person to handle the isolation, the cold, the constant challenges. Most folks need other people around, need the security of the community. But some people manage it. Some do. Morrison's been up there longer than anyone, and can remember, must be 20 years or more. Whatever he's got going, it works for him. Has he ever married? Had a family? Sam shrugged. Nobody knows much about his past. When he first showed up in Cedar Ridge, he was already a man who kept his own counsel. Some folks say he was a soldier. Others think maybe he had some kind of trouble back east. Truth is, most of us learned early on that Morrison doesn't invite questions about his personal business. That evening, Clara sat in her new apartment above the general store, looking out at the mountains that ringed the valley. Somewhere up there, perhaps 20 miles away, James Morrison was settling into his isolated home for another winter. The image fascinated her more than it should have. She tried to focus on practical matters. The work at the store was honest and would provide security. Sam Wheeler was a fair employer, and the community, while rough around the edges, seemed to operate by a code of basic decency. She could build a respectable life here, perhaps even save enough money over time to establish some small independence. But the thought of years stretching ahead, each much like the next, filled her with a restlessness she couldn't name. She had come west seeking something more than mere survival, though she hadn't been able to articulate exactly what that something was. The deception that had brought her to Cedar Ridge had shattered her immediate plans, but perhaps it had also freed her from assumptions about what her life had to be. 3 days into her employment at Wheeler's store, Clara was sweeping the front porch when she noticed fresh graves in the small cemetery on the hill above town. She asked Sam about them during their noon break. "Winter claims folks every year," he said matter-of-factly. "Mostly the old ones, or those who come up here already sick, thinking the mountain air will cure what ails them. Sometimes mining accidents. It's a hard country. Are those recent graves? The Henderson family came up from Kansas last month trying to start a ranch in the high meadows. Whole family took sick with pneumonia, lost all 3 children and the mother. Father headed back east on yesterday's train, broken man." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How often does that happen?" "More often than folks like to talk about. Mountains don't care about your plans or your dreams. They'll kill you if you're not prepared. Don't respect what you're up against." The conversation stayed with Clara as she went about her daily tasks. The graves on the hill served as a stark reminder of the price of miscalculation in this unforgiving environment, yet people continued to come, drawn by dreams of gold, land, or simply a fresh start away from the constraints of settled society. A week later, Clara was helping Sam prepare for winter inventory when she overheard a conversation between 2 local ranchers that made her stop and listen. "Morrison's got the right idea," one of them was saying. "Found himself a place where he can live on his own terms. Don't have to answer to nobody, don't have to worry about what society thinks is proper. Yeah, but what kind of life is that? No family, no friends, nobody to talk to except maybe his horses. Some folks prefer it that way. And from what I hear, he's got quite a setup up there, hidden valley with water and grass, sheltered from the worst weather. Lives better than half the people in town. Still seems like a lonely way to spend your days. Maybe, or maybe he's the smartest one of all, of us." That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed, thinking about the conversation. What would it mean to live completely on your own terms? To be beholden to no one, responsible only for yourself, free to make whatever choices felt right, without consideration for social expectations or conventional wisdom. The idea both thrilled and terrified her. She had been raised to believe that women needed protection, needed the security of family or marriage, or at least respectable employment. The notion of complete self-reliance had never been presented as a possibility, much less a desirable goal. But hadn't her journey west already demonstrated that conventional wisdom wasn't always reliable? The security of marriage to Robert Ashford had proven to be a fantasy. The safety of staying in Boston would have meant slow starvation in the tenements. Perhaps the greatest risk wasn't in choosing an unconventional path, but in limiting herself to paths that others deemed appropriate. 2 weeks into October, the first serious snow began to fall. Clara watched from the store window as fat flakes settled on the street and rooftops, transforming Cedar Ridge into something almost beautiful. The miners and ranchers who came into the store talked increasingly of winter preparations, of stocking up on supplies before the passes became impassable. "Won't see Morrison again until spring now," Sam mentioned as they watched the snow accumulate. "Trail up to Marble Canyon becomes treacherous once the snow starts in earnest. He's got enough supplies to last through until the thaw." Clara found herself wondering what it would be like to be snowed in for months, completely cut off from other people. The thought should have been frightening, but instead she felt a curious sense of envy. To have months with nothing but your own thoughts, your own projects, your own rhythm of days. No obligations to others, no need to maintain social niceties, no pressure to be anything other than exactly what you were. That afternoon, she asked Sam an unexpected question. "Mr. Wheeler, do you think it would be possible for someone to learn mountain survival skills? Someone with no experience but a willingness to work hard?" Sam looked up from the ledger he was updating. "Thinking of taking up prospecting?" "Not exactly. I'm just curious about what it would take to live independently. In this country, it's not easy, even for folks who've been doing it for years. Need to know about weather patterns, food preservation, basic medicine, how to handle emergencies when you're days away from help. He studied her face. Can I ask what's got you thinking along these lines? Clara hesitated, then decided on honesty. I appreciate the work here, Mr. Wheeler, and you've been very fair with me. But I came west looking for something more than just another version of the life I left behind. I'm wondering what other possibilities might exist. Sam nodded slowly. I can understand that feeling. This country does something to people, makes them think about what they really need versus what they've been told they need. He was quiet for a moment. There are books about mountain living, survival techniques. Some of the old trappers and prospectors have written down what they learned. If you're serious about learning, I could order some for you. I'd appreciate that. But Clara, I hope you understand what you'd be considering. Mountain living, especially alone, is about as difficult as life gets. One mistake, one piece of bad luck, and there's nobody around to help. I understand the risks, Mr. Wheeler, but I'm beginning to think there are different kinds of risks. Sometimes playing it safe is the most dangerous choice of all. That evening, Clara stood at her window, watching the snow fall more heavily. Somewhere out there, James Morrison was settled into his hidden valley for the winter, living proof that complete independence was possible. The fact that he had managed it for 20 years suggested that it wasn't just possible, but sustainable. She thought about the graves on the hill, the dreams that had ended in disappointment or tragedy. But she also thought about the life she'd been living in Boston, the slow grinding away of hope and possibility. Perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't in taking risks and failing, but in never taking risks at all. For the first time since discovering Robert Ashford's deception, Clara felt something stirring within her that might have been excitement. The breaking point that had brought her to Cedar Ridge might not have been an ending after all. It might have been the beginning of something she had never dared to imagine. The survival books arrived from Denver on the first train that could make it through. After the October blizzard, Clara unwrapped them in her small apartment, spreading the volumes across her kitchen table like treasures. Mountain Man's Guide to Wilderness Living, Surviving the High Country, and The Trapper's Handbook, 3 worn books that promised to unlock secrets she'd never imagined needing. By lamplight, she read about building shelters from pine boughs and stones, about reading weather patterns in cloud formations, about preserving meat without salt and finding water in winter. The knowledge felt foreign, yet compelling, like learning a language she had always been meant to speak. "You're burning a lot of midnight oil up there," Sam Wheeler observed the next morning as Clara yawned over the morning inventory. "Those books, keeping you up? They're fascinating. I had no idea how much there was to learn about living off the land." Sam gave her a long look. "Clara, I hope you're not getting ideas about heading into the wilderness on your own. Book learning and real experience are 2 completely different things entirely. I'm just educating myself about possibilities, Mr. Wheeler. Knowledge never hurt anyone." But even as she spoke, Clara knew she was moving beyond mere curiosity. Each night brought new revelations about skills she could master, challenges she could potentially overcome. The book spoke of men who had carved lives from the raw wilderness with nothing but determination and hard work. If they could do it, why couldn't she? The first real test of her resolve came 3 weeks later when Dr. Marcus Hayes arrived in Cedar Ridge on the westbound train. A thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent his life indoors. He immediately sought out lodging at the Mountain View Inn. "Doctors hear about Henderson Place," Martha Patterson told Clara when she stopped by for supplies. Seems there was some confusion about the property ownership. Bank in Kansas is claiming the family still owed money on the land they tried to. Homestead up in the high meadows. Clara felt a familiar chill of recognition. What kind of confusion? The kind that usually means someone's been taken advantage of. Dr. Hayes represents the bank. Says the Hendersons never actually owned the land they died trying to work. Whole thing was some kind of fraudulent scheme. It was like hearing her own story reflected in tragedy. The Hendersons had been victims of deception, just as she had been, but their miscalculation had cost them everything. The parallel was too stark to ignore. That evening, Dr. Hayes appeared at Wheeler's store just before closing time. He moved with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to conducting unpleasant business, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm like a weapon. "I'm looking for information about the Henderson family's situation," he told Sam, "particularly any local witnesses to their attempt to establish residence on the disputed property." Sam's expression hardened. "Those people died up there, mister. Seems to me they paid whatever debt they might have owed." The bank's position is that fraudulent land claims cannot be legitimized by tragedy, Dr. Hayes replied coldly. The property in question was never legally available for homesteading. The family was deceived by confidence men operating out of Kansas City. Clara set down the broom she had been using to sweep the front porch. "How did the deception work, Doctor?" Hayes turned his attention to her, noting her educated speech and obvious interest. A syndicate would identify available but difficult-to-access land, then advertise it as prime homesteading territory. They'd provide false deeds, collect fees for processing claims, and disappear before the victims discovered the truth. And the real owners, usually banks or railroad companies that held legitimate title. In the Henderson case, the land belongs to a mining consortium based in Denver. It was never available for private ownership. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Clara's mind was racing ahead to implications Dr. Hayes probably hadn't considered. If the Henderson property was fraudulent, how many other land claims in the area might be questionable? How many people were living on property they didn't actually own? More immediately, what happened to land where the victims had died before? The deception was discovered? "Dr. Hayes," she asked as he prepared to leave, "what becomes of improvements made to fraudulent claims? Buildings, cleared land, that sort of thing?" "Legally, they belong to the rightful owner. Practically, most. Legitimate owners write them off as losses unless the improvements have significant value." He studied her face. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about how these situations resolve." But Clara was more than curious. An idea was forming, dangerous and probably foolish, but with an undeniable logic. If the Henderson property was essentially abandoned, if the legitimate owners considered it a write-off, it might be possible for someone to establish a presence there. Not through fraudulent claims, but through simple occupation of land that no one else wanted to use. The high meadows where the Henderson family had died were perhaps 15 miles from Cedar Ridge, accessible by a rough trail that wound through pine forests and across mountain streams. According to the conversations she had overheard, the location was beautiful but challenging. Good grazing land in summer, brutally isolated in winter. Isolated. The word that should have been frightening instead felt like a promise. Over the next few days, Clara made discreet inquiries about the Henderson property. The picture that emerged was both tragic and intriguing. The family had managed to build a small cabin before winter set in, had cleared perhaps 2 acres for a garden, and had established a decent well. All of that work remained, abandoned to the elements. "Trail up, there's getting dangerous with the snow," warned Tom Bradley, one of the local ranchers who had helped search for the Henderson family when they failed to appear in town for supplies. "Come spring, probably won't be much left of their improvements anyway. Mountain winters are hard on empty buildings. but Clara found herself wondering what might be salvaged, what might be rebuilt. The books she had been studying were full of techniques for winterizing cabins, for maintaining structures in harsh conditions. If someone were there to tend things, to make repairs as needed, the opportunity to see the property came unexpectedly when Dr. Hayes announced he needed a guide to visit the site for his official report. Most of the local men were busy with their own winter preparations, but Tom Bradley finally agreed to take him up the trail before the snow got too deep. "I'd be interested in seeing the property as well," Clara mentioned to Tom when he stopped by the store for supplies. "I've been curious about what those poor people went through." Tom looked surprised. "It's a hard ride, Miss Bennet. Trail's rough even in good weather, and we might run into snow squalls." "I'm a stronger rider than I might appear, Mr. Bradley. And I think it's important to understand what happened to the Henderson family." Tom considered this, then nodded. "Suppose you could come along if Dr. Hayes doesn't object. Bring warm clothes and be ready to turn back if the weather turns bad." Dr. Hayes proved indifferent to Clara's presence, focused as he was on completing his business efficiently. The three of them set out on a crisp November morning, following a trail that climbed steadily through forests of pine and aspen toward the high meadows. Clara had ridden before, but never in terrain like this. The mountain ponies Tom had selected were sure-footed and steady, but the trail demanded constant attention. It wound along cliff edges, crossed streams on fallen logs, and switchbacked up steep slopes that left her breathless in the thin air. But as they climbed higher, the views became increasingly spectacular. The valley spread out below them like a detailed map, with Cedar Ridge looking like a collection of toy buildings scattered among the trees. Above them, snow-capped peaks caught the morning sun and threw it back in brilliant displays of light and shadow. "Beautiful country," Dr. Hayes admitted during one of their rest stops. "I can see why people would be drawn to it, even if they didn't understand the challenges." "The challenges are part of the appeal," Clara found herself saying. "Living somewhere that demands your best, that doesn't forgive carelessness or weakness." Tom gave her a sharp look. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "Just thinking about what it would take to succeed in a place like this." The Henderson property, when they finally reached it, was both more and less than Clara had expected. The cabin was small but solidly built, constructed of pine logs, with a stone foundation and a steep roof designed to shed snow. Windows on 3 sides would provide good light and views of the surrounding meadows, but the signs of tragedy were everywhere. Personal belongings scattered by wind and weather, a small cemetery with 4 rough wooden crosses, the garden plot already reverting to wilderness. It was a place where dreams had died hard. Dr. Hayes conducted his survey with professional detachment, making notes about the cabin's construction, the cleared land, the well that Tom confirmed still produced good water. Clara found herself paying attention to different details: the cabin's orientation to catch winter sunlight, the natural windbreaks provided by surrounding trees, the way the meadow sloped to provide drainage. "Shame to see it all go to waste," Tom commented as they prepared to leave. "They did good work for folks who didn't know much about mountain building." "What will happen to it now?" Clara asked. "Nature will take it back, most likely. Without someone to maintain things, the cabin will be kindling in a few years. The cleared land will grow back to forest." On the ride back to Cedar Ridge, Clara found herself looking over her shoulder at the abandoned homestead. There was something haunting about the way it sat in the meadow, like a question waiting for an answer. Someone had believed enough in this place to risk everything for it. That their gamble had failed didn't necessarily mean the place itself was cursed. That evening, she spread her survival books across her kitchen table again. But this time, she was reading with a specific location in mind. The Henderson cabin could be weatherized for winter occupation. The well provided water, The cleared land could be expanded for gardens, the surrounding forest offered game and firewood. It would be dangerous, probably foolish, and certainly unconventional. But it would also be completely independent, utterly free from the expectations and limitations that had shaped her life until now. The book spoke of men who had chosen similar paths, who had traded security for freedom and found the exchange worthwhile. They had learned through trial and error, had made mistakes and survived them, had gradually built lives of their own design in the wilderness. If they could do it, why couldn't she? The question that had been growing in Clara's mind for weeks finally crystallized into something approaching a plan. Not a complete plan, not yet, but the skeleton of one. She would spend the winter learning everything she could about mountain survival. She would save every penny of her wages, building a fund for supplies and equipment. And when spring came, when the trails were passable again, she would return to the Henderson property and see if it might be possible to establish a life there. It was a plan that would have horrified her parents, that would send the proper ladies of Boston into fits of shock. A single woman, living alone in the wilderness, miles from civilization and help, it violated every convention about appropriate behavior for her gender and class. But as Clara sat in her small apartment above the general store, listening to the wind howl around the building and thinking about the abandoned cabin in the high meadows, she felt something she had never experienced before. Not just excitement, but a deep sense of rightness, as if she were finally moving toward the life she was meant to live. The deception that had brought her to Cedar Ridge had shattered her conventional dreams. But perhaps that shattering had been necessary, clearing away assumptions and expectations that had never really fit. Perhaps she wasn't meant for conventional dreams at all. 3 days later, Clara made a decision that surprised even her. She approached Sam Wheeler during the slow afternoon period when the store was empty of customers. "Mr. Wheeler, I need to ask you about something. If I wanted to purchase survival supplies, camping equipment, preserved foods, tools for wilderness living, could you order them for me?" Sam set down his inventory ledger and studied her face. "Clara, what exactly are you planning?" She had prepared for this question, but actually voicing her intentions still felt momentous. "I'm considering the possibility of establishing myself on abandoned property in the high country, living independently, supporting myself through trapping, perhaps some small-scale mining." The Henderson place. It wasn't a question. Sam had clearly been expecting this conversation. "You think I'm foolish. I think you're brave and probably a little crazy, which isn't necessarily a bad combination in this country." Sam was quiet for a moment. "But Clara, what you're talking about is incredibly dangerous. Even experienced mountain men sometimes don't make it through hard winters. I understand the risks, but I also understand the alternatives. I can work for someone else for the rest of my life, dependent on their goodwill and subject to their decisions. Or I can try to build something that's completely my own. And if you fail, if you get in over your head up there—" Clara met his gaze steadily. "Then I'll have failed attempting something meaningful rather than succeeding at something small." Sam nodded slowly, and she could see him reaching a decision. "All right, if you're determined to do this, at least let's make sure you're properly equipped. I'll order what you need, and I'll teach you what I can about reading weather signs and emergency procedures. You'll help me?" "Clara, I've watched you work for 2 months now. You're intelligent, determined, and you don't give up when things get difficult. If anyone can make a go of it in the high country, it might be you." He paused. "Besides, this country was built by people who were willing to try things others thought impossible." Over the following weeks, Clara and Sam planned her equipment needs with the thoroughness of a military campaign. Warm clothing and waterproof gear, tools for building and repair, preserved foods that would last through a mountain winter, medical supplies, ammunition for hunting. The cost was substantial, nearly 6 months of her wages, but Clara found she didn't care. Money was only valuable if it could purchase something worth having, and the possibility of complete independence was worth far more than financial security. As December settled over Cedar Ridge with bitter cold and heavy snows, Clara continued her education in mountain survival. She practiced building fires in wind and wet, learned to preserve meat using techniques the books described, studied the subtle signs that predicted weather changes in the high country. Some evenings, she found herself standing at her window looking north toward the invisible canyon where James Morrison spent his winters in solitude. Somewhere out there was proof that what she contemplated was not only possible, but sustainable. He had been doing it for 20 years, carving out a life completely on his own terms. The knowledge that such a life was possible sustained her through the darkest days of winter, when the wind shrieked around the building and the temperature dropped so low that her breath froze in the air. Each blizzard was a reminder of what she would face in the high meadows, but also an opportunity to test her resolve. By February, Clara knew her decision was final. When spring came, she would leave Cedar Ridge and attempt to establish herself. On the abandoned Henderson property, she would trade the security of employment for the risk and potential reward of complete independence. It was a gamble that might cost her everything. But as she had learned from the books she studied so intently, the greatest risk was often in playing it too safe, in never testing the limits of what was possible. The mountain winter was teaching her that survival wasn't just about avoiding danger, but about embracing the challenges that revealed what you were truly capable of. And Clara Bennett was beginning to suspect she was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The spring thaw came late to the Colorado Rockies, but when it finally arrived in mid-April, it transformed the landscape with startling speed. Clara watched from her apartment window as the snow retreated up the mountainsides, revealing meadows brilliant with wildflowers and streams swollen with runoff. The world seemed to be awakening from a long sleep, and she felt the same stirring within herself. Her supplies had been accumulating all winter in the back room of Wheeler's store. Canvas tarps and rope, preserved foods and ammunition, tools for building and repair, warm clothing and medical supplies, everything she would need to establish herself in the high meadows where the Henderson family had perished. Trail should be passable in another week or two, Sam Wheeler observed, as they inventoried her growing collection of equipment. You sure about this, Clara? Last chance to change your mind and stay civilized. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. It was true. The long winter months had only strengthened her resolve. She had read every book on mountain survival she could find, practiced essential skills whenever possible, and saved nearly every penny of her modest wages. Most importantly, she had discovered within herself a hunger for independence that grew stronger rather than weaker as spring approached. The first real test of her preparations came when Martha Patterson knocked on her door one evening in late April, her face tight with concern. Clara, I need to speak with you about something serious. There's been talk in town about your plans. Clara invited her in and poured coffee, noting the older woman's obvious discomfort. What kind of talk? The kind that could cause problems for a young woman living alone. Word's gotten around about the supplies you've been buying, about your intentions regarding the Henderson place. Martha paused, choosing her words carefully. Some folks think it's improper for an unmarried lady to be planning such an undertaking. And what business is it of theirs? In a small town like Cedar Ridge, everything becomes everyone's business eventually. There's been suggestions that perhaps the county should intervene for your own protection. Clara felt a familiar anger rising. Intervene how? There's talk of having you declared incompetent to make such decisions. A woman alone, attempting something so dangerous and unconventional. Some people see it as evidence of unsound judgment. The threat was both infuriating and sobering. Clara had escaped the social constraints of Boston only to discover that the frontier carried its own set of limitations for women who stepped too far outside acceptable boundaries. Who's behind this? Reverend Phillips has been vocal about it. He's convinced that allowing you to proceed would set a dangerous precedent. Some of the town council members agree with him. Reverend Phillips was a stern man in his 60s who had arrived in Cedar Ridge the previous fall to establish a proper church. His sermons focused heavily on maintaining moral order and appropriate social roles, themes that resonated with residents who wanted to bring Eastern respectability to their frontier community. What exactly are they proposing? A competency hearing before Judge Crawford. If they can convince him that your plans demonstrate unsound judgment, he could appoint a guardian to manage your affairs. The irony was bitter. She had come west to escape exactly this kind of paternalistic control, only to find it following her into the wilderness. But Clara had learned something about herself during the long winter months. She would not be deterred by threats, legal or otherwise. When is this hearing scheduled? Next week. Clara, I'm telling you this because I think you have a right to know what you're facing, but I also think you should seriously consider modifying your plans, maybe staying closer to town, or finding a companion for your venture. A companion? Clara smiled grimly. You mean a husband to make my choices respectable? Martha's silence was answer enough. That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table with maps spread before her, studying the terrain between Cedar Ridge and the high meadows. If the town was determined to prevent her departure through legal means, she would have to leave before they could act. It wasn't the way she had planned to begin her new life, but then nothing about her journey west had gone according to plan. The next morning, she approached Sam Wheeler with a request that clearly didn't surprise him. I need to accelerate my timeline. Can you have everything ready to go by tomorrow evening? Sam studied her face. They're really going to try to stop you. Apparently, my desire for independence is being interpreted as evidence of mental instability. Damn, fools. Sam's language was unusually strong. Begging your pardon, Clara, but this kind of thinking is exactly what keeps this country from reaching its potential. Takes courage to try something new, and courage shouldn't be punished just because it comes in a female package. Will you help me? Already planned to. Been packing your supplies since yesterday. Tom Bradley's agreed to guide you up to the Henderson place, though he thinks you're crazy too. And what do you think? Sam was quiet for a moment. I think you're the bravest person I've met in 20 years of frontier living. And I think if anyone can make a go of it in the high country, it's you. The next evening, as the sun set behind the western peaks, Clara loaded her supplies onto a pack train of 3 sturdy mules. Tom Bradley had insisted on the extra animals, arguing that she would need more equipment than she initially realized. Mountain living's about redundancy, he explained, as they secured the loads. Everything breaks, gets lost, or wears out faster than you expect. Better to have too much than too little. Clara had changed from her storekeeping dress into the practical clothing she had assembled for mountain life. Wool pants, leather boots, a heavy jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat that would protect her from sun and weather. She felt like she was putting on a new identity along with the new clothes. As they prepared to depart, Sam Wheeler appeared with a final gift, a well-used but reliable rifle and a box of ammunition. Every person living alone in the mountains needs to be able to hunt and protect themselves, he said simply. This belonged to my late brother. He'd be pleased to know it was going to someone who'd make good use of it. The weight of the weapon in her hands was both sobering and empowering. It represented responsibility and capability, the tools of true independence. They left Cedar Ridge in the pre-dawn darkness, following the familiar trail toward the high meadows. But this time, Clara wasn't returning after a day's exploration. This time, she was going home to a place she had never lived, to build a life she had never imagined possible. The journey took most of the day, with frequent stops to rest the pack animals and adjust loads. Tom proved to be an excellent guide and teacher, pointing out landmarks, explaining the subtle signs that indicated weather changes, sharing practical knowledge about mountain travel. "Key thing to remember," he said during one rest stop, "is that the mountains don't care about your schedule or your comfort. They'll demand respect and they'll punish mistakes. But if you learn to work with them instead of against them, they'll support you." As they climbed higher, Clara felt her excitement building. Every mile took her further from the social expectations and limitations that had shaped her life. Every step was toward a future entirely of her own making. The Henderson property looked different in spring than it had during her winter visit. The meadows were green and dotted with wildflowers, the streams ran clear and full, and the cabin seemed less tragic and more promising. Someone had built well here, creating a foundation that could support new dreams. Tom helped her unload the supplies and conducted a thorough inspection of the cabin's condition. The roof was sound, the walls were solid, and the stone foundation had weathered the winter without significant damage. The well still produced clean water, and the cleared land was ready for planting. "You've got good bones to work with," he admitted as they surveyed the property. Henderson knew what he was doing, even if he got swindled on the land rights. "What about those land rights? Am I risking the same kind of legal problems?" Tom shrugged. "Way I see it, the legitimate owners have written this place off. They're mining company executives in Denver who've never seen this valley and never will. You improve the property, make it productive, and eventually someone might be willing to sell it to you for back taxes." It wasn't a perfect legal situation, but it was workable. Clara had come to understand that frontier life often operated in the spaces between established law and practical necessity. That first evening in her new home, Clara sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sun set over the peaks that surrounded her meadow. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of wind in the pines and the distant call of an eagle. She was alone in a way she had never been before, miles from the nearest neighbor, responsible entirely to herself. It should have been frightening. Instead, it felt like coming home. Over the following days, Clara threw herself into the work of establishing her homestead. She reinforced the cabin's chinking against wind and weather, organized her supplies for efficient access, and began preparing the garden plot for planting. Each task was a small victory, proof that she was capable of the life she had chosen. The physical demands were greater than anything she had experienced. Her hands blistered from unfamiliar tools, her back ached from lifting and carrying, and she fell into bed each night exhausted. But it was the exhaustion of meaningful work, of building something that belonged entirely to her. The books she had studied proved invaluable. Techniques for food preservation, methods for reading weather signs, strategies for maintaining equipment in harsh conditions, all of it became immediately practical rather than theoretical knowledge. She began to understand why the authors had emphasized the importance of preparation and redundancy. 2 weeks into her new life, Clara faced her first serious challenge when a late spring snowstorm moved in without warning. She woke to find 6 inches of fresh snow covering her garden plot and the temperature dropping rapidly. Everything she had read about mountain weather patterns came into play as she secured her supplies, banked her fire, and prepared to wait out the storm. For 3 days, the wind howled around the cabin while snow piled against the walls. She used the time to organize her interior space, to read, and to plan future improvements. When the storm finally passed, Clara emerged to find a transformed landscape. The snow was already melting in the spring sunshine, but the experience had been a valuable lesson in the unpredictability of mountain weather. She made notes about Preparations for the next unexpected storm, modifications to her cabin that would make it more weather-resistant. The isolation that might have driven others to despair became Clara's greatest source of strength. Without the constant presence of other people, she discovered aspects of herself that had been hidden by social obligations and expectations. She found that she enjoyed her own company, that she could think more clearly without the noise and distractions of community life. She also discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. When a section of her roof began to leak, she climbed up and made repairs herself. When her axe handle cracked, she carved a replacement from seasoned oak. When her food supplies ran low, she supplemented them with wild plants she had learned to identify from her survival books. Each successful problem-solving experience built her confidence and deepened her commitment to the life she was creating. She wasn't just surviving in the mountains, she was beginning to thrive. A month after her arrival, Clara encountered her first large wildlife when a black bear wandered into her clearing while she was working in the garden. Her heart pounded as she slowly backed toward the cabin, but she remembered her reading about bear behavior and avoided the common mistakes that could trigger an attack. The bear investigated her garden with obvious interest, then wandered away into the forest, without causing any real damage. But the encounter reminded Clara that she was sharing this territory with creatures that were bigger, stronger, and more at home in the wilderness than she was. That evening, she took extra care to secure her food supplies and considered the bear's visit from a different perspective. The animal had been curious rather than aggressive, had investigated and departed without conflict. Perhaps coexistence was possible if she remained respectful of the established residents. As spring progressed into early summer, Clara's garden began to produce its first harvest. Lettuce and radishes, herbs and early vegetables, proof that she could feed herself from the land she was working. She preserved what she couldn't eat immediately, building stores for the winter that would eventually come. The work was constant and demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying. Each plant she tended, each improvement she made to the cabin, each skill she mastered was an investment in her future independence. She was creating something that no one could take from her, something that would be limited only by her own effort and imagination. 2 months into her mountain life, Clara realized that she had stopped thinking about the world she had left behind. Cedar Ridge seemed like a distant memory, Boston like something from another lifetime. The woman who had stepped off the train looking for a fictional husband had been replaced by someone stronger, more capable, and more confident. But even as she reveled in her growing competence and independence, Clara remained aware that her experiment was still in its early stages. She had proven that she could establish herself in the mountains, but the real test would come with winter. The books she had studied were full of warnings about the challenges of mountain winters, about the mistakes that could prove fatal when help was days away. For now, though, summer stretched ahead with its promise of growth and learning. Clara had laid the foundation for her new life. Whether she could build successfully upon it remained to be seen. But for the first time since leaving Boston, she felt that her future was truly in her own hands. Standing in her garden one evening, watching the sun paint the surrounding peaks, in shades of gold and purple, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The deception that had shattered her original plans had led her to something far more valuable than the conventional marriage she had sought. She had discovered that she was capable of living entirely on her own terms, answerable to no one but herself. It was a discovery that would have been impossible within the constraints of civilized society, but here in the wilderness, surrounded by the eternal mountains and the vast sky, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The Hermit, in Marble Canyon, had proven that such a life was sustainable. Now Clara was determined to prove that it was achievable not just by men who fled civilization, but by women who refused to accept its limitations. She was building more than just a homestead in the high meadows. She was building a new definition of what was possible. The first sign of trouble came in early July, when Clara spotted smoke signals rising from the peaks to the east. 3 distinct columns, spaced and timed in a pattern that spoke of deliberate communication rather than accidental fires. She'd read about such signals in her survival books, but had never expected to see them used in her isolated valley. Standing in her garden with a basket of freshly picked beans, Clara watched the signals with growing unease. Someone was communicating across the mountains, and the organized nature of the signals suggested more than casual conversation. In her 2 months of solitary mountain life, she had seen no evidence of other human presence in the area. That evening, she climbed to the highest ridge accessible from her property and scanned the surrounding terrain with the field glasses Tom Bradley had insisted she bring. The vast wilderness stretched in all directions, seemingly empty of human activity, but the smoke signals had proven that appearances could be deceiving. 3 days later, Clara discovered fresh horse tracks along the stream that formed her property's eastern boundary. Multiple animals, unshod hooves, moving in single file through terrain that most riders would consider impassable. The tracks were perhaps a day old, heading north toward the higher peaks. Her books had mentioned the presence of Ute tribes in the Colorado mountains, though most had been relocated to reservations in recent years. But not all had accepted relocation, and some bands still moved freely through the traditional territories, particularly in the most remote areas where government agents rarely ventured. Clara felt no immediate fear of the unknown travelers. Her reading had taught her that most conflicts between settlers and native peoples arose from competition over land and resources, or from misunderstandings about intentions. She was occupying abandoned property, making no claim to vast territories, and had no intention of preventing anyone else from using the traditional travel routes. But the presence of others in her wilderness refuge was still unsettling. Part of the appeal of her isolated life was the complete independence it provided, the freedom from having to consider other people's needs, opinions, or reactions. The knowledge that she was not truly alone changed the dynamic of her daily existence in subtle but significant ways. A week later, Clara's solitude was shattered more directly when she discovered a man watching her from the tree line while she worked in her garden. He remained motionless for perhaps 10 minutes, observing her activities with obvious interest, then melted back into the forest as silently as he had appeared. Clara's heart pounded as she considered the implications. The watcher had been a white man, dressed in frontier clothing rather than traditional native garb. His presence suggested that her departure from Cedar Ridge had not gone unnoticed, that perhaps people were actively seeking her location. That night, she loaded her rifle and kept it within reach as she went about her evening routines. The cabin, that had felt like a secure refuge, suddenly seemed vulnerable, isolated, and exposed. Every sound from the surrounding forest took on potential significance. Every shadow might conceal a threat. The next morning brought visitors who made their presence known in a more conventional manner. Clara was splitting firewood behind her cabin when she heard horses approaching along the trail from the south. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, moving at the slow, steady pace of men who had been traveling for some time. She recognized the lead rider immediately, Judge Crawford from Cedar Ridge, the same man who was supposed to have presided over the competency hearing she had fled. With him were 2 men she didn't recognize, both wearing the practical clothing and confident bearing of experienced frontiersmen. Clara set down her axe and walked around to the front of her cabin, the rifle cradled casually in her arms. Not threatening, but clearly visible and ready for use if necessary. "Miss Bennett," Judge Crawford called as they approached, "we've come a long way to speak with you." Judge Crawford. I'm surprised to see you so far from town. Clara's voice was steady, though her mind was racing through possible responses to whatever legal challenge they might present. The judge dismounted, his movements stiff from long hours in the saddle. He was a man in his 60s, grey-bearded and stern, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his authority respected. Miss Bennett, I'm here in my official capacity to inform you that a competency hearing has been scheduled in your absence. Given your failure to appear and defend yourself, the court has made certain determinations about your mental state and decision-making capacity. What determinations? You've been declared incompetent to manage your own affairs. As your court-appointed guardian, I'm here to escort you back to town where proper arrangements can be made for your care and supervision. Clara felt the familiar anger rising, the same fury that had driven her to leave Boston when Victor Caldwell had tried to control her choices. I'm curious, Judge Crawford, about the legal basis for declaring someone incompetent without allowing them to present a defense. Your actions speak for themselves. An unmarried woman living alone in the wilderness, attempting to survive by means that would challenge experienced mountain men. Such behavior demonstrates clear evidence of unsound judgment, or it demonstrates independence and self-reliance, qualities that I thought were valued on the frontier. One of Crawford's companions, a lean man with cold eyes and a deputy's badge, shifted restlessly in his saddle. Judge, we could be here all day debating philosophy. The woman's coming back to town whether she agrees or not. Clara's grip tightened on her rifle. And if I refuse, then we'll take you back by force, the deputy replied. Court order gives us the authority. The second man, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Miss Bennett, I'm William Hayes, attorney from Denver. I've been retained by certain parties to ensure this matter is handled properly according to territorial law. The name Hayes was familiar. Clara remembered Dr. Marcus Hayes, who had investigated the Henderson property fraud. This was likely a relative, suggesting that the same interests that had profited from the Henderson family's deception were now targeting her. Which parties retained you, Mr. Hayes? That's confidential, but I can tell you that there are concerns about the precedent your actions might set. Women abandoning their proper roles, living without male supervision or protection, claiming property through squatters' rights rather than legal ownership. These behaviors threaten the stability of civilized society. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Clara's successful establishment of an independent life in the mountains was being seen as a dangerous example, something that might encourage other women to reject conventional limitations. The threat wasn't just to her personal freedom, but to the social order that kept women dependent and controllable. I'm not claiming property through squatters' rights, Clara said carefully. I'm occupying abandoned land that the legitimate owners have written off as worthless. I'm harming no one and threatening nothing except conventional assumptions about what women are capable of achieving. Conventional assumptions exist for good reasons, Judge Crawford replied. They protect women from their own poor judgment and protect society from the consequences of that judgment. Clara felt a cold clarity settling over her thoughts. These men hadn't traveled days into the wilderness out of concern for her welfare. They had come because her success threatened something they valued more than her freedom. Gentlemen, I'm going to have to decline your invitation to return to town. As you can see, I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs. The deputy's hand moved toward his pistol. That wasn't a request, lady. And this isn't a threat, Clara replied, raising her rifle slightly. It's simply a statement of fact. I will not be returning to Cedar Ridge, willingly or otherwise. The three men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected armed resistance. Judge Crawford's expression hardened. Miss Bennett, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. We have legal authority here. Your legal authority extends to Cedar Ridge and the surrounding county. This property is outside your jurisdiction, on land that may not even be part of Colorado territory, depending on how the survey lines were drawn. It was a bluff, but Clara delivered it with conviction. The confusion about property ownership that had killed the Henderson family might now provide her protection. William Hayes frowned. That's a very technical legal question that would require considerable research to resolve definitively. Then I suggest you go back to Denver and conduct that research. Until you can prove jurisdiction, I'm under no obligation to recognize your authority. The standoff stretched for several minutes. 3 armed men on horseback facing one woman with a rifle in front of a remote mountain cabin. Clara's heart was pounding, but her hands remained steady. She had discovered something about herself. During her months in the mountains, she would not be intimidated or controlled, regardless of the consequences. Finally, Judge Crawford remounted his horse. This isn't over, Miss Bennett. We'll return with proper documentation and sufficient force to ensure compliance. You're welcome to try, but I should mention that I'm not entirely alone up here. There are others in these mountains who value independence and don't appreciate interference from lowland authorities. It was another bluff, but the smoke signals and horse tracks lent it credibility. The 3 men departed without further argument, but Clara knew they would return better prepared and more determined. As their horses disappeared into the forest, Clara sank onto her porch steps, the rifle across her knees, and tried to process what had just occurred. Her peaceful mountain existence had been shattered by the arrival of people who refused to accept her right to live as she chose. But even as she felt the weight of the new threats, Clara also felt a surge of pride. She had faced down 3 men who came to drag her back to civilization, had stood her ground and sent them away. The woman who had fled Boston in desperation had been replaced by someone who would fight for her freedom. That evening, Clara made careful preparations for the return of her unwanted visitors. She moved her most essential supplies to a cache hidden in the forest, prepared secondary escape routes from her cabin, and considered the tactical advantages and disadvantages of her position. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. Clara was reinforcing her cabin's window shutters when she heard a single horse approaching from the north. The rider who emerged from the tree line was unlike anyone she had ever seen. He was perhaps 50 years old, with long grey hair and a full beard, dressed in a combination of frontier clothing and native elements that spoke of someone who had lived between 2 worlds. His horse was a sturdy mountain pony, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man completely at home in the wilderness. "Morning," he called as he approached. "Name's Marcus Whitehawk. Been watching your place for a few days." Clara kept her rifle ready, but didn't point it in his direction. "Watching why?" "Heard you had visitors yesterday. Figured they might be the kind of visitors that cause problems for folks who value their privacy." "You saw the whole thing?" Marcus nodded, dismounting and approaching slowly. "Saw enough. Also, saw you handle yourself well. Not many people stand up to Judge Crawford and his friends. You know Crawford? Know of him. He's been extending his reach into areas where it's not welcome. Claims he's bringing law and order to the wilderness, but mostly he's bringing the kind of order that benefits certain business interests." Clara lowered her rifle slightly. "You live up here?" "I live wherever the mountains let me. Been in these parts for about 15 years, moving between the high valleys depending on the season." Marcus studied her cabin and the improvements she had made. "You've done good work here. Henderson built it well, but you've made it better." "You knew the Henderson family?" "Knew them. Good people. Bad situation. Same kind of situation you're facing now in some ways." "How so?" Marcus sat on a fallen log near her porch, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The Henderson family was targeted because they represented something dangerous to certain interests. Independent homesteaders, successfully working land that was supposed to be worthless, proof that people could make their own way without depending on the systems that keep others in power. And now I'm representing the same thing. Worse, from their perspective, you're a woman doing what they claim women can't do. If word gets out that Clara Bennett is thriving alone in the high mountains, other women might start getting ideas about independence. The analysis matched Clara's own assessment, but hearing it confirmed by someone with more experience in frontier politics was both validating and sobering. What do you think they'll do when they come back? Depend on how desperate they are to make their point. Could be they'll bring enough men to simply overwhelm you. Could they try to make it look like an accident, claim you died of your own poor judgment rather than their interference? The second possibility hadn't occurred to Clara, but it made horrible sense. If she simply disappeared, it would confirm their arguments about the dangers of women living independently in the wilderness. Any suggestions? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying the surrounding terrain. You could come with me, deeper into the mountains where they'd never find you. There are places up there where a person could live undisturbed indefinitely. Hidden places? Valleys that don't appear on any maps? Canyons that can't be reached except by those who know the secret routes? The mountains are full of such places for those who know how to find them. Clara felt a stirring of interest. You're talking about places like where James Morrison lives. Marcus's expression sharpened. You know about Morrison? I heard about him in Cedar Ridge, the hermit of Marble Canyon who's lived alone in the mountains for 20 years. Morrison's a good man, though he keeps to himself more than most. His valley is one of the hidden places I'm talking about. Sheltered, well-watered, rich soil, protected from the worst weather. Have you been there? Once, years ago. Morrison and I have an understanding. We respect each other's privacy, but help when help is needed. This might be one of those times when help is needed. Clara looked around at the homestead she had worked so hard to establish. The garden she had planted and tended, the cabin she had improved and modified, the small corner of wilderness she had claimed as her own. The thought of abandoning it all was painful. But the thought of being dragged back to Cedar Ridge in chains, or worse, disappearing entirely to prove a point about women's limitations, was far more painful. How would it work? This hidden valley arrangement. I'd guide you there, introduce you to Morrison, see if he'd be willing to share his space temporarily. Most of these mountain hermits got that way because they value independence above everything else. They understand when someone else's independence is threatened. And if he says no, then we find another solution. Mountains are big, and there are other hidden places. But Morrison's Valley would be the safest option if he's agreeable. Clara made her decision with the same decisive clarity that had brought her to the mountains in the first place. When do we leave? Tonight, if you're ready. Travel's easier in the dark, and it'll give us a head start before your visitors come back. As the sun set behind the western peaks, Clara packed her most essential belongings onto the mules she had kept from her original journey. Everything else, the cabin improvements, the garden, the carefully organized supplies, would have to be left behind. But as she took one last look at the homestead she was abandoning, Clara realized that she wasn't retreating in defeat. She was advancing towards something even more ambitious, a life of complete independence in a place so remote that the outside world could never reach her. The mountains had taught her that true security didn't come from building walls against threats, but from being prepared to move beyond the reach of those threats entirely. Tonight, with Marcus Whitehawk as her guide, she would discover just how far beyond that reach could extend. The journey through the night-darkened mountains was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. Marcus Whitehawk led them along paths that seemed to exist only in his memory, winding through forests so dense that starlight barely penetrated the canopy overhead. They travelled mostly in silence, the soft footfalls of their animals muffled by pine needles and the whisper of wind through ancient trees. As dawn broke over the eastern peaks, they reached a narrow canyon entrance hidden behind a waterfall that cascaded down smooth granite walls. Marcus dismounted and approached the falling water, running his hands along the rock face until he found handholds invisible to Clara's untrained eye. "This is it," he said quietly. "Marble Canyon. Morrison's. Been living back there for more than 20 years, and in all that time, maybe a dozen people have found this entrance." Clara studied the waterfall with growing amazement. From any angle, except the precise spot where they stood, it appeared to be nothing more than water cascading against solid rock. But Marcus had revealed a narrow gap behind the falls, just wide. Enough for a person and horse to pass through single file. How did he find this place? Story goes that Morrison was being tracked by some men who meant him harm. He was wounded, desperate, following a game trail when he stumbled onto this canyon. The entrance saved his life, and he's been protecting it ever since. They led their animals carefully through the gap behind the waterfall, water misting around them as they emerged into a hidden world that took Clara's breath away. Marble Canyon opened into a valley perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide, completely enclosed by towering granite walls that rose nearly vertical on all sides. The valley floor was a paradise of green meadows, clear streams, and scattered groves of aspen and pine. Gardens were laid out in careful geometric patterns, and several substantial log buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water sources. Horses grazed in fenced pastures, and the morning air carried the sounds of chickens and the lowing of cattle. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, hardly believing such a place could exist hidden in the heart of the wilderness. Morrison's had 20 years to perfect it. Everything you see here he built with his own hands or traded for with people he trusted. A figure emerged from the largest of the log buildings, walking toward them with the unhurried gait of a man on his own land. James Morrison was tall and lean, with silver-grey hair and a beard that spoke of years away from barbershops. His clothes were well-made but practical, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence Clara remembered from their brief encounter in Cedar Ridge. But what struck her most powerfully were his eyes, grey-green like mountain streams, holding depths that suggested both intelligence and a wariness born of experience. When those eyes met hers, Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went beyond mere physical attraction. "Marcus," Morrison said, his voice carrying the roughened edge of someone who spoke infrequently. "Wasn't expecting. You back so soon. Brought someone who needs sanctuary, James. This is Clara Bennett." Morrison's gaze shifted to Clara, and she saw the moment of recognition. The woman from Cedar Ridge, the one who bought supplies for mountain living. "You remember me? I remember thinking you were either very brave or very foolish. Judging by the fact that you're here with Marcus, I'd guess it was some of both." Marcus quickly explained the situation. Crawford's attempt to drag Clara back to town, the legal threats, the danger of her disappearing entirely if she remained in her exposed position at the Henderson property. Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. When Marcus finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying Clara with an intensity that made her feel as though he were taking her measure in ways she couldn't fully understand. "You stood up to Crawford and his men," Morrison said finally. "That took courage. It took necessity. I won't be controlled by men who think they know what's best for me better than I do." Something that might have been a smile touched Morrison's bearded face. "I can understand that sentiment. The question is, what do you want now? Marcus says you need sanctuary, but sanctuary for how long? Until this blows over or permanently? Clara considered the question carefully. I want what you have, Mr. Morrison. Complete independence from a world that insists on imposing its limitations on people who refuse to accept them. That kind of independence comes at a price. You give up connection to the outside world, to family, to the social structures that most people depend on for meaning and security. I've already given up those things. I came west looking for something different, and I found it in the mountains. What I haven't found is a place secure enough that I don't have to keep looking over my shoulder. Morrison nodded slowly. This valley has been my refuge for 20 years. It's given me peace, security, and the freedom to live exactly as I choose. But it's also been a lonely existence. Loneliness is better than control, is it? That's a question I've asked myself many times, especially during the long winters when the only conversation is with my animals. Clara felt the weight of his words, the suggestion of years spent in solitude that had perhaps grown heavier rather than lighter with time. Are you saying you'd welcome company? I'm saying I'd welcome the right kind of company. Someone who understands the value of what this place represents, who wouldn't try to change it or make it more like the world we both left behind. Marcus cleared his throat quietly. James, those men who came after Clara aren't going to give up. Crawford's got backing from powerful people who see her success as a threat to the established order. If she stays in any accessible location, they'll eventually find her. And if she disappears completely, they'll claim it proves their point. About women not being capable of independent living, Morrison added, understanding the political dimensions of the situation. Exactly. But if she's here, protected by the hidden nature of this valley, she can continue to live independently without giving them the satisfaction of failure or tragedy. Morrison looked around his valley, at the life he had built in complete isolation, then back at Clara. It would mean sharing a space I've kept to myself for 2 decades, sharing decisions about how the valley is used, how resources are managed. I wouldn't want to impose on your established routines, Mr. Morrison. I have my own supplies, my own equipment. I could establish myself in a separate part of the valley. James, Morrison said quietly, if we're going to be sharing this space, you should call me James. The simple invitation to use his first name felt like a significant gesture from a man who had lived in such complete solitude. Clara found herself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years, squinting into mountain sun, the calloused hands that told of decades of hard physical work. There's a meadow on the north side of the valley that would be suitable for a cabin, James continued. Good water, sheltered from the worst weather, far enough from my buildings to provide privacy for both of us. You're offering to let me stay? I'm offering to let you try staying. We'll see how it works out. If either of us finds the arrangement unsatisfactory, we'll figure out alternatives. Clara felt a surge of gratitude mixed with something else, excitement at the prospect of sharing this hidden paradise with someone who understood its value. I accept your offer, James, and I promise I won't interfere with the life you've built. Here, building a life takes time and effort. If you're going to be here, you might as well contribute to making it better rather than just avoiding making it worse. Marcus smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Clara had seen from him. I'll help you get established, Clara. Then I'll be moving on. Got my own winter preparations to make. Over the following days, Clara discovered that James Morrison had created something far more sophisticated than the simple hermit's refuge she had expected. The valley was a completely self-sufficient operation, with extensive gardens, livestock, workshops, and storage facilities that could support several people through the harshest mountain winters. James proved to be an excellent teacher, sharing 20 years of accumulated knowledge about mountain living with a generosity that surprised her. He showed her techniques for food preservation she hadn't found in any book, demonstrated methods for reading weather patterns specific to high-altitude valleys, and explained the subtle art of managing resources in an environment where waste could mean the difference between comfort and survival. "The key," he explained as they worked together to build a cabin framework in the meadow he had designated for her use, "is thinking in cycles. Nothing is wasted, everything serves multiple purposes, and you plan not just for this season but for seasons, years in the future." Clara found herself fascinated not just by his knowledge, but by the man himself. James Morrison combined physical competence with intellectual depth in ways she had never encountered before. He could discuss philosophy while splitting logs, could analyze complex problems while performing routine maintenance tasks. "What brought you to this valley originally?" she asked one evening as they shared dinner at the rough table outside his main cabin. James was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Finally, he set down his coffee cup and looked out at the valley walls that enclosed their hidden world. "I was a different person 20 years ago, had a life in Denver, a business, responsibilities to other people. But I made some enemies, powerful, men who decided I was inconvenient to their plans." "What kind of business?" "Engineering. I designed mining operations, helped smaller companies compete with the big syndicates. That made me unpopular with certain interests who preferred to eliminate competition rather than meet it." Clara felt a chill of recognition. "They tried to destroy you. They tried to kill me, came very close to succeeding. I was wounded, running for my life through these mountains when I found this valley. It saved me, and I've been protecting it ever since." "Do you ever regret leaving that life behind?" James considered the question seriously. "I regret the necessity that forced the choice, but I don't regret the choice itself. This valley has given me something I never had in Denver: complete freedom, to live according to my own values and priorities. No loneliness, plenty of loneliness, but loneliness chosen is different from loneliness imposed. Here I'm alone by choice, which makes it bearable." As Clara's cabin took shape and her understanding of valley life deepened, she found herself drawn into increasingly personal conversations with James. Despite his years of solitude, he proved to be a thoughtful conversationalist with strong opinions about politics, literature, and the direction of American society. "The country's changing," he observed one afternoon as they worked on installing windows in her cabin. "Growing more organized, more controlled. Individual independence is becoming a luxury that fewer people can afford." Is that why places like this valley are important? Places like this prove that independence is still possible for those willing to work for it. They're proof that people don't have to accept the limitations that society tries to impose. Clara felt the truth of his words in her bones. "That's exactly what I was trying to prove at the Henderson property, that a woman could live independently, support herself, make her own decisions. And that's exactly why Crawford and his backers want to stop you. Your success threatens their assumptions about what's natural and necessary." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching through the canyon entrance. James, immediately grabbed his rifle, motioning for Clara to get behind the cabin walls. In the weeks she had been in the valley, no one had approached the hidden entrance. 3 riders emerged from behind the waterfall, moving with the confident bearing of men who knew exactly where they were going. Clara's heart sank as she recognized Judge Crawford, Deputy Wilson, and William Hayes, the same 3 men who had confronted her at the Henderson property. But they were not alone. Behind them came 6 more riders, all armed, all carrying themselves with the professional competence of hired gunmen. Crawford had returned with overwhelming force, clearly intending to settle the matter permanently. "Morrison," Crawford called out as they approached the cabin cluster, "we know you're harboring a fugitive from justice. Send Clara Bennett out, and there won't be any trouble." James stepped into view, his rifle held ready, but not yet aimed. "Judge Crawford, you're trespassing on private property. This valley isn't on any legal survey. According to territorial law, it's unclaimed land available for homesteading. According to territorial law, you have no jurisdiction outside your county boundaries. And according to common decency, you have no right to pursue a woman whose only crime is refusing to accept your authority over her life. Clara emerged from behind the cabin, her own rifle in hand. She had fled once from these men, abandoned the homestead she had worked so hard to establish. She would not flee again. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow, "you've come a long way for nothing. I'm not returning to Cedar Ridge, and I'm not accepting your authority over my choices." Deputy Wilson spurred his horse forward. "Miss Bennett, you're under arrest for contempt of court and violation of a competency ruling. You'll come with us peacefully, or we'll take you by force." "The lady has made her position clear," James said, his voice hardening. "She's under my protection in this valley." William Hayes urged his horse closer, studying the valley with obvious interest. "Quite an impressive setup, Morrison. Must be worth a considerable sum. Be a shame if word got out about its location, brought unwanted attention from tax assessors and territorial officials." The threat was clear. If James continued to protect Clara, they would destroy his sanctuary by exposing it to outside authorities. "Mr. Hayes," Clara said, stepping forward, "I believe you're operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about this situation." "What misunderstandings?" "You assume that I'm here as a refugee, dependent on Mr. Morrison's charity and protection. That's not accurate." Clara moved to stand beside James, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Mr. Morrison and I have entered into a partnership, a business arrangement for the joint development and management of this valley property." James glanced at her, surprise flickering in his grey-green eyes, but he didn't contradict her claim. "What kind of partnership?" Hayes asked suspiciously. "The kind that makes us legal equals in the ownership and management of this property. The kind that gives me standing to refuse your demands and the resources to resist your threats." It was a desperate gambit, but Clara delivered it with absolute conviction. If James would support her claim, they might present a united front strong enough to deter Crawford's plans. "That's preposterous," Crawford sputtered. "An unmarried woman cannot enter into such arrangements without proper legal oversight." "Judge Crawford," James said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "you're about to learn something about territorial law that apparently wasn't covered in your legal education." He paused, letting the silence stretch until all 9 men were focused on his words. "In cases of business partnerships established on unclaimed territorial land, the partners have the right to establish their own governance structures and dispute resolution mechanisms. Federal territorial statutes supersede county authority in such circumstances." It was a bluff, but James delivered it with the authority of someone who had clearly studied the relevant law. Hayes frowned, obviously uncertain about the legal complexities involved. "Furthermore," Clara added, "any attempt to remove me from this property against my will would constitute interference in a legitimate business enterprise, which is a federal offense under territorial commerce regulations." The hired gunmen were beginning to look uncomfortable, glancing between their employers and the 2 people who seemed surprisingly confident in their legal position. Crawford's face was red with frustration. "This is ridiculous. A woman living in sin with a known hermit claiming business partnership to avoid legal authority." "Judge Crawford," James said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than shouting, "you just made a serious mistake." He raised his rifle, not quite pointing it at the judge, but making his readiness clear. "You insulted the lady's honor and impugned her character. In this valley, that's something I take personally." The standoff stretched for long moments. 9 are men facing 2 people who seemed completely unintimidated by the odds against them. Clara felt James's presence beside her like a source of strength. his quiet confidence steadying her own resolve. Finally, William Hayes urged his horse. Back a few steps. Gentlemen, I think we need to research the legal questions involved before proceeding further. The territorial statutes regarding business partnerships are complex, particularly in cases involving unclaimed land. Crawford looked ready to argue, but Hayes continued firmly. If we proceed incorrectly, and these people do have legitimate legal standing, we could face serious federal charges ourselves. The hired gunmen were clearly relieved by any excuse to avoid what was looking like a potentially costly confrontation. Clara had noticed that James's rifle wasn't the only weapon visible. Several other rifle barrels were glinting from concealed positions around the valley, suggesting that Marcus Whitehawk hadn't left the area after all. "This isn't over," Crawford said, wheeling his horse around. "We'll be back with proper documentation and federal authority." "You do that, Judge," James replied. "But next time you come calling, I suggest you bring better lawyers and more polite language." As the 9 riders departed through the waterfall entrance, Clara felt her legs go weak with reaction. The confrontation she had dreaded for months was finally over, and somehow she had emerged victorious. "Partnership?" James asked quietly, a hint of amusement in his voice. It seemed like the best way to establish legal standing. Was I wrong? James was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those deep grey-green eyes. "No," he said finally, "I don't think you were wrong at all." The silence that followed the departure of Crawford's men was profound, broken only by the distant sound of the waterfall and the whisper of wind through the pines. Clara stood beside James in the meadow, both of them still holding their rifles, neither quite ready to believe that the confrontation was truly over. "Do you think they'll actually return?" Clara asked, finally lowering her weapon. James studied the waterfall entrance, where their unwanted visitors had disappeared. "Crawford might try, but Hayes is too smart to push a weak legal position. And those hired guns won't be eager to come back after seeing how well prepared we were for their visit." Clara followed his gaze and realized she could now see what she had missed during the confrontation. Rifle barrels glinting from concealed positions among the rocks and trees around the valley. Marcus didn't leave. Marcus has friends in these mountains. Word spreads quickly when someone needs help defending their independence. James smiled slightly. "You've got more allies than you realized." Over the following days, Clara learned the truth about the network of people who had chosen to live beyond the reach of conventional society. Marcus had indeed spread word about her situation, and the valley had been quietly surrounded by men and women who understood the importance of protecting someone's right to live free from external control. "There's maybe 30 or 40 of us scattered through these mountains," James explained, as they worked together on finishing her cabin. "Trappers, prospectors, folks who had troubles with the law, people who just couldn't stomach civilization anymore. We don't organize formally, but we help each other when help is needed. I had no idea such a community existed. Most people don't. That's how we keep it working. The outside world assumes we're all dangerous hermits or crazy prospectors. They don't realize we've got doctors, teachers, engineers, even a few lawyers among us." Clara found herself fascinated by this hidden society that existed in the spaces between official authority and wild nature. These were people who had made the same choice she had, trading security for freedom, accepting risk in exchange for independence. As summer progressed into early autumn, Clara's cabin was completed, and she had established her own routines within the valley's rhythms. But she found herself spending increasing amounts of time working alongside James, learning from his accumulated knowledge while contributing her own skills and perspectives. The partnership she had declared during the confrontation with Crawford began to feel more real with each passing day. They planned valley improvements together, shared decisions about resource management, and developed an easy collaboration that felt natural despite their very different backgrounds. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you in Cedar Ridge," James observed one evening as they sat on his porch watching stars emerge over the valley walls. "What did you expect? Someone who would struggle with the isolation, who would eventually get homesick for civilization and want to return to a more conventional life." Clara considered this. "I think I'm discovering that I was never suited for conventional life. I just didn't know there were alternatives until I was forced to find them. And now I can't imagine living any other way. This valley, this freedom to make our own choices without interference. It's everything I was looking for without knowing I was looking for it." James was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the starlight. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Of course." "When you declared our partnership to Crawford, were you just finding a way to establish legal standing, or did you mean something more than that?" The question she had been anticipating and avoiding for weeks was finally asked directly. Clara felt her heart rate increase as she considered how to respond. "I meant it as more than just a legal strategy, if that's what you're asking." "What? Did you mean it as—" Clara took a deep breath, summoning the same courage that had brought her to the mountains. "I meant it as an acknowledgement that what we've built here together is more valuable than what either of us could have created alone. A recognition that partnership, real partnership, is about more than just sharing work and resources." James moved closer to her on the porch bench, close enough that she could see the firelight reflecting in his grey-green eyes. "Clara, I've been alone in this valley for 20 years. In all that time, I never imagined sharing it with anyone. Never thought I could trust another person enough to let them into the life I'd built. And now I realize that what I thought was complete independence was actually just elaborate isolation. I was protecting myself from the possibility of loss by refusing to risk connection." Clara felt something shift between them, a recognition that they were moving beyond practical partnership towards something deeper and more personal. "James, when I left Boston, I thought I was looking for a husband who would give me security and respect. When that turned out to be a deception, I thought I wanted complete independence from all human connections. What do you think you want? Now, I want what we have here, a partnership between equals who choose to be together rather than people who need to be together. A relationship built on mutual respect and shared values rather than social expectations or economic necessity." James reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "That sounds like a proposal. Would you accept it if it were?" Instead of answering with words, James leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing intensity as she responded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I accept," he said quietly, "but I have one condition." "What condition?" "If we're going to be true partners in this valley, in this life, then we should make it official, not because society demands it, but because we choose it." Clara felt a surge of joy that surprised her with its intensity. "Are you proposing marriage?" "James Morrison, I'm proposing a partnership that includes marriage, if you're willing. A commitment to build this life together, to share not just the work and the resources, but the dreams and the future." "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, officiated by Marcus Whitehawk, who, it turned out, had been ordained as a minister before choosing mountain life. The ceremony was held in the meadow where Clara's cabin stood, with the granite valley walls rising around them like the nave of a vast cathedral. The guest list was unlike any wedding party Clara could have imagined in her Boston days. Mountain, men and frontier women, People who had chosen independence over conformity gathered to witness the union of two souls who had found in each other the completion of their chosen freedom. "You realize," Marcus said during the simple ceremony, "that you're both giving up the pure independence you came to these mountains to find." "No," Clara replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We're discovering that true. Independence isn't about being alone. It's about choosing your connections freely rather than having them imposed upon you." James squeezed her hand. "What we're choosing is interdependence. Two complete people deciding to build something together that neither could create alone." After the ceremony, as their guests shared food and stories around a bonfire in the meadow, Clara found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. The mail-order bride scheme that had seemed like her only escape from Boston's limitations had led her to something far more valuable than the conventional marriage she had originally sought. "Any regrets?" James asked, finding her standing at the edge of the firelight, looking up at the stars. "Only that it took me so long to realize that what I was really looking for couldn't be found through conventional means." "What were you looking for?" "Someone who would see me as a complete person, rather than a problem to be solved or a resource to be managed. Someone who would choose to be with me because of who I am, not because of what I could provide or what role I could fill." James nodded. "I spent 20 years thinking that kind of connection was impossible, that trusting another person with access to your real self was too dangerous to risk." "What changed your mind?" "Watching you stand up to Crawford and his men, seeing someone else who valued independence enough to fight for it, realizing that you weren't looking for someone to take care of you, but for someone to share the adventure with." As autumn deepened into winter, Clara and James settled into the routines of married life in their hidden valley. But it was unlike any marriage either had imagined possible. They were partners in every sense, sharing work, decisions, dreams, and daily life without either dominating or being diminished by the other. The valley provided everything they needed for physical survival, but more importantly, it provided the space for them to define their relationship entirely on their own terms. No social expectations to meet, no family pressures to navigate, no conventional roles to fulfill unless they chose to do so. "I've been thinking about expansion," James said one evening as they planned spring improvements to the valley. "What kind of expansion?" "The valley could support more people if they were the right kind of people. Folks like us who value independence but understand the benefits of the chosen community." Clara felt a stirring of excitement at the idea. A place where people could live free from external control, but still have the support and companionship of others who share their values. Exactly. Not a commune or a collective, but a loose association of independent households who choose to cooperate rather than being forced to compete. Over the winter months, they developed plans for what such a community might look like. Additional cabins in suitable locations throughout the valley, shared resources like workshops and storage facilities, common areas for gatherings and celebrations. A place where independence and community could coexist. The key would be selecting the right people, Clara observed. Folks who understand that freedom requires responsibility, that independence means taking care of yourself rather than expecting others to do it for you. People like the ones who came to help us face down Crawford, folks who've proven they're willing to stand up for what they believe in. As spring arrived and the valley began its annual renewal, Clara found herself thinking about the contrast between her current life and the one she had left behind in Boston. The city that had once seemed like the center of civilization now felt like a prison of artificial constraints and arbitrary limitations. Here in the hidden valley, she and James were creating something entirely new, a life built on their own choices rather than society's expectations. They had proven that marriage could be a partnership of equals, that independence and connection could strengthen rather than compromise each other. "Do you ever wonder what happened in Cedar Ridge after we disappeared?" Clara asked one morning. "As they worked together in their expanded garden, I heard from Marcus that Crawford tried to claim we had died in the mountains, that your fate proved his point about women not being capable of independent living. And then word started spreading about a successful partnership between a mountain hermit and an eastern lady who had outsmarted the judge and his backers. Stories have a way of growing in the telling." Clara smiled, imagining the tales that might be circulating through mining camps and frontier towns. "Think any of those stories might inspire other women to question the limitations they've been told to accept?" "I hope so. Change happens one person at a time, one choice at a time. If our story helps even one person realize they have more options than they thought, then we've contributed something valuable." As summer returned to the valley, Clara and James received their first visitors, who came seeking not confrontation but opportunity. A young couple from Kansas, fleeing the same kind of social constraints that had driven Clara west, had heard stories about the hidden valley and the people who had created a new way of living. "We don't know if we're suited for mountain life," the woman, Sarah, admitted as they shared dinner around the outdoor table. "But we know we're not suited for the life we're expected to live in conventional society." "Mountain life isn't for everyone," James replied honestly. "It requires skills most people don't possess and a willingness to accept responsibility for your own survival. But if you're willing to learn and work, there are worse places to discover what you're really capable of." Over the following weeks, Clara and James shared their knowledge with the young couple, teaching them essential skills while evaluating their commitment to the challenges of independent living. It became clear that Sarah and David possessed both the determination and the flexibility necessary for success in the mountains. "There's a suitable site for a cabin about a half-mile up the North Ridge," James told them after a month of evaluation. "Good water, protected from the worst weather, close enough for mutual support, but far enough for privacy. You're willing to let us stay?" David asked, hardly believing their good fortune. "We're willing to let you earn the right to stay," Clara corrected. "Independence isn't given, it's claimed through effort and sustained through competence." As autumn approached and the new cabin took shape on the North Ridge, Clara reflected on how much their hidden valley had changed in just 1 year. What had begun as James's solitary refuge had evolved into something unprecedented, a community of truly independent people who chose cooperation over isolation. "Think we're creating something that could last?" she asked James one evening as they watched smoke rising from the new cabin's chimney. "I think we're creating something that proves different ways of living are possible. Whether it lasts will depend on whether future generations value independence enough to maintain it. And if they don't, then at least we'll have proven it was possible, even if only temporarily. Sometimes that's enough to demonstrate that alternatives exist, even if they're not permanently sustainable." Clara nodded, understanding that their hidden valley was both an end in itself and an example for others. They had created a life of genuine freedom, but more importantly, they had proven that such a life was achievable for anyone willing to reject conventional limitations in favor of chosen possibilities. Standing on their porch as the first snows of winter began to dust the valley walls, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. The deception that had shattered her original plans had become the catalyst for discovering a life far more meaningful than anything she could have imagined. She had come west as a mail-order bride seeking security through conventional marriage. She had found instead a partnership that transcended traditional roles, a love that strengthened rather than constrained her independence, and a community that proved cooperation and freedom could coexist. "No regrets?" James asked, following her gaze out over their transformed valley. "None," Clara replied without hesitation. "Only gratitude for the detour that led me exactly where I was meant to be." As snowflakes began to fall more heavily, coating the valley in pristine white, Clara understood that she had found something infinitely more valuable than the conventional happiness she had originally sought. She had found the courage to define her own life on her own terms, and in James Morrison, she had found someone who not only supported that courage, but shared it completely. The hidden valley would continue to evolve, welcoming others who sought genuine independence while maintaining the principles that made such independence possible. It was, Clara realized, exactly what she had been looking for all along. Not just a place to live, but a way of living that honored both individual freedom and chosen connection. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Cedar Ridge seeking a fictional husband had become something far more significant, a woman who had helped create a new model for how life could be lived when conventional constraints were replaced by conscious choice. It was a legacy that would endure long after the snows melted and spring returned once again to Marble Canyon. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.